Good day, and I'm sorry to not be in Osaka, Japan with you folks. I hope you're having a great convention, and I would like to talk about stroke from a survivor perspective. One of the things that people are told as survivors is that there's a magical kind of 1 year to recover the plasticity of the brain. That is not true. I've found from personal experience that this is not true. I was nothing like I am today after 1 year. I was still on a cane. I was not speaking that well. I had my stroke in 1996. I was a hemorrhagic stroke. I was aphasic, incontinent, and I was in the hospital for 10 days. I was hiccuping in the hospital, so I slept most of the time. I was later transferred to a nursing home in Connecticut, where I was for 3.5 months. Insurance was much more robust than it is today in America. I had therapy 6 days a week, 5 to 6 hours a day, to get over the residuals from my stroke. So my journey started at that very low level. And one of the things I learned is that as a survivor wants to be an independent person. So the holy grail of all recovery is to become an independent person. And I've developed the 9 pillars of stroke victor recovery. And the first pillar is survivor optimism and engagement. Now I say that because from personal experience and observation, in order to recover from a stroke, I think you have to be smiling. I think you have to be very engaged in your process. I often saw people in the nursing home going through their therapy. They were kind of just going through it, but they weren't making progress because they weren't engaged. And so depression being a significant side effect of stroke, that will block any serious recovery in my estimation. And so that it's really important that survivors be optimistic and engaged, and therefore that may require psychological treatment, perhaps some depression reduction medicine. I didn't have any of that. I was so sick I didn't realize how sick I was. But that's the first pillar. And the second is traditional therapy. And I think everybody at this convention knows more about traditional therapy perhaps than I do. The one thing that I learned in therapy, it was to try and work with people on a one-to-one basis and not work with a team. And when I say team, I mean several physical therapists rotating around. Rather have one physical therapist, one occupational therapist, one speech therapist. Now, obviously, that assumes that there's good chemistry between myself or a survivor and the therapist. But other than that, I think I want to focus on the other pillars. The third pillar, well, before we get to the third pillar, you have to smile, and you have to keep going. Now, in America, at that stage, therapy gets cut off, and I think that's the case in many countries around the world. But the survivor has to keep moving. And so embrace a brain and heart healthy lifestyle. What do I mean by that? The first thing is mental health. Get your mental health squared away. Brain healthy, consider the mind diet. Or any of these diets. You want to live a life of health. in my case, I got down to my basic training weight, for example. Well, I went through the military during the Vietnam War, and I went to basic training in a place called Fort Polk, Louisiana, and it was very hot. It was very tough basic training. I lost about 30 pounds during basic training, and I got down to 155. And I say this because there's an obvious negative impact of having extra weight, and the way I explain it to survivors is pick up a cement block and walk around with it for an hour and see what you feel like at the end of that hour, if you can even hold it for an hour. Well, if you've had a stroke and you've got some disability, why put extra pressure on your body? Why do that? It doesn't make any sense. So, as I say, embrace a heart-healthy diet. You certainly don't want to, you want to mitigate the likelihood of a second stroke. And as everybody here knows, for the first couple of years after a stroke, there's going to be a higher risk for a stroke. So I say, get down to that level. The next pillar that I think is very important and that I did was participate in clinical research. After I was finished with my 2+ years of outpatient therapy, my outpatient therapy included occupational therapy and physical therapy and aquatherapy in a warm pool and speech therapy and therapy, frankly, for the therapy. Because, every day I was doing therapy. And then as I plateaued in certain respects and physical therapy came to an end, I started working with an exercise physiologist in the center where I was going. It was a world-class center. And so I was working with exercise physiologists. I was still there 4 or 5 days every single day. Embrace clinical research. When we moved back down to Florida, soon after I started therapy again, just to see if the plateau that I reached could be improved. My feeling, my speech, my walking. And a young gal walked over to my table one day and she said, "You need to go to the Brain Rehab Research Center up in Gainesville, Florida." And that is a joint venture between the University of Florida Medical School, Shand, and the Veterans Administration. And at that center, they do academic clinical research. And they screened me, I was accepted, and it was the only time in my life that it was better to be low functioning, because then I got more studies. I spent the better part of a summer up there, and I did constraint therapy, and that was kind of the late stages of clinical research. I was able to use my hand much better from the constraint therapy. And I was able to, for example, hold a bottle. Now, I couldn't do this before I had constraint therapy. So, and more importantly in Florida, I'm able to hold a wine glass, and that's much more important in Florida, believe me. So then I also did, when Christopher Reeves had his very significant accident, he got onto locomotion equipment, which is, he was hanging over a treadmill and working. They had never done that with a stroke patient. I did that also with them. We spent a couple of weeks on it, and I speeded up my walking 25% in 2 weeks. With pre-testing and post-testing, they started me off at half my weight and gradually brought me down over the 2-week period to regular weight. Clinical research is a way to get the benefit of free, state-of-the-art medicine. So it's something to be considered by a survivor, no question about it. And as I say, I found it very, very constructive. Consider getting involved in integrative research and alternative therapies. When we came down here, I still couldn't speak publicly. I still couldn't have done this sort of thing that I'm doing right now. And then a therapist used what was called then ETPS, is now I guess called MPS. And she did it on my brain, on my bowie, the soft spot on my head. And after a couple of treatments, I said to my wife, you know, Debbie, I think I can speak publicly again. Just the light went on. It was just incredible. And then I started to take work with speech coaches, I should say speaking coaches, and to get to become a better speaker. But there are lots of integrative, there are lots of therapies, several of the Asian therapies were used, cold laser. All of these therapies don't have the amount of research, particularly in America, behind them that some other therapies, more traditional therapies do. But that doesn't mean they don't work. It only means that they haven't had all this research. You know, nothing works for everybody. Aspirin doesn't work for everybody. So I found that also very, very important so I was able to get my ability to speak back publicly. Now, in my previous life, I had been a management consultant. And management consultants, they speak when they're asleep. They sleep all the time. They're always talking. And I was the same way. And I did a lot of expert witness work where I had to speak very coherently. And I wasn't able to do that after the stroke until I had this MPS treatment. There's some other therapies like abasia and many other therapies that I'm glad to, if people ask questions by email, I'm glad to respond. When I was up at the sixth pillar is develop coping strategies. When you're a survivor of a stroke, you know, the doctor who ran this brain rehab, research rehab center, he said to me, look, Bob, you're not going to be able to get back to what you were before the stroke. But that doesn't mean that you can't find other ways to accomplish the same thing. And a perfect example of that is that I used to be a righty. Now I'm a lefty. And I taught myself to write lefty and to eat lefty. And recently I'm able to use chopsticks lefty. And the story behind that is that when I was a younger man, actually a child, I was pretty good at ping pong. And if I was better than my opponent, I very often would play lefty. And it was a more even, more fun. And you know, I thought to myself in the nursing home, and I wasn't really able to speak, let's try lefty. If I could play ping pong lefty, perhaps I can write lefty. And quite easily I was able to shift lefty. My only problem was I was making my S's, my Z's, and my checks backwards. And now I do it once in a while just to remind myself of where I came from. But there are lots of coping strategies. Another coping strategy that I've learned is to walk downstairs backwards. If there's only one banister rather than two on staircase, and if it's on the wrong side, you know, you have to, I just learned to walk backwards. When I was in a nursing home, the therapist worked with me, and I learned to go down backwards. And you know, when I do it in public, people look and they are kind of astounded. It wasn't that difficult to learn with professional help. So those are typical coping strategies that I use. And everybody has a different stroke, and everybody is a different person, so everybody has different things that become important to them. Remember earlier in my talk, I said the holy grail of recovery is independence. Well, if you can't walk stairs up and down, you are not going to be independent. That's a big problem. Even walking into a building with 3 or 4 stairs, it doesn't have to be an entire flight. So one has to find other ways to get around to be independent. The 7th is to be actively inquisitive. So when therapy comes to an end and you sign off, in America now, there isn't much in the way of support groups. In the UK, certainly there's a very, very robust support groups. In Canada and in Ontario, there also is, and in Australia, and maybe in other countries, and I'm not so familiar with Japan. But in any event, one has to, in one way or the other, one has to become actively inquisitive to look for new things that are coming out, because there's always new things being developed, there's always new equipment being developed, there's always new approaches being developed, and sometime maybe there'll be some pharmaceuticals that might be able to help. Because one of the things I would like to see happen is that a pill is developed for tone reduction in your arm. You see, my arm is, has significant tone in it, and it has for some time. So be actively inquisitive. That's part of the engagement that I talked about earlier in my talk. To be actively engaged in your process of recovery. It's very important to appreciate, the 8th pillar is appreciate the role of the caregiver partner. Very often, the caregiver is sort of shunted to the side by the healthcare community. The focus is on the survivor, and that's quite appropriate. But the caregiver is very important. So my wife, for example, I mean, she had to find a appropriate place for me to go after I was in the hospital, and so she developed some criteria. Most importantly, that since it was a nursing home and I was only in my 50s, other men were there, and that they have neuro training. The therapist had neuro training, that it was clean. She had a variety of things. But going forward, the caregiver partner becomes very important. When we were looking for outpatient therapy, she was very specific. She wanted to make sure that the therapist had neuro training. And so it took us a little time to find that. But it ultimately worked out fine. Again, going forward for a caregiver on a kind of day-to-day basis, the caregiver partner plays a very significant role when there's a disability. But the caregiver, it's important that the caregiver take care of themselves also, not just take care of the survivor. Because the health of the caregiver has a direct impact on the health of the survivor. And I have witnessed in the fitness center that I go to most every day, there's three couples that come in. And the men have all had strokes. And the women, once they get their husbands or partners, whoever they are, on the equipment, they sit on their phones, on their smartphones, instead of engaging in physical fitness themselves. And one of the couples I'm friendly with, and I said to the gal, I said, you know, park Gino on the side, and then you work out when he's finished. He can wait, and that's fine. And because it's really important that the caregiver create their own life, and that they not have a bad feeling about it, that they not feel guilty about about creating their own life. Debbie kept teaching during the time period that I was getting better at the early phases. Really important for the caregiver. So the caregiver needs that support, and support is clearly an issue for caregivers. Then you have to consider new lifestyle opportunities. New lifestyle opportunities. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are always new things you can do. Now, right now, I'm doing equine therapy. And equine therapy turns out to be good for people with MS and Parkinson's and stroke. So I've been doing that for 7 or 8 months. In fact, today I actually rode. I ride about once a week. They function on the academic schedule. And so I've ridden since the latter part of last summer. And I've found that it's helped my balance, and it's really helped my confidence too, is riding. I had never ridden before. And so equine therapy, there are all kinds of other things. Photography is something you might not have considered, or art or music, things that might not require you to do quite the amount, be on your feet, or quite the amount of physical things. So I suggest that people they consider new lifestyle opportunities to develop kind of the new me and the new us. And because you are a new me and a new us. Only less than 10% of people with strokes have no residual long-term effect. And I personally believe that everybody has some residual effect because they know they've had a stroke, and they know that their risk is elevated after they have a stroke. And so there is that fear that's inside them, even if they don't have a physical disability or any other, or maybe a mental disability. So part of my story then is I wrote a book, Stroke Victor, How to Go from Stroke Victim to Stroke Victor. And writing that book, I came to realize that, and this again is a new opportunity, a new me. I found that writing the book, I realized how underserved the whole stroke community was. In America, I can't speak for every other country. And not enough research, not enough alternatives, not enough support after reimbursed therapy comes to an end, and frankly, not enough reimbursed therapy, because the amount of money that's spent on other diseases versus stroke is way out of whack, completely out of whack with reality, which is why I advocate for more therapy for everybody. Well, writing the book, I realized how underserved stroke was, and so I started something called the Stroke Recovery Foundation. And initially, I was focused on just the recovery process. But as time went on and I spoke publicly, everybody asked me about prevention and what were the risk factors. And so we've included our mission, prevention, awareness, and also recovery. And our mission is success with stroke, success in realizing that there is a stroke and taking effective moves, which include not driving to the hospital, but calling 911 and letting them do their thing. Now, you don't know if you've been, you know if you've successfully not had a stroke. You don't know what you might have mitigated. But anyway, stroke success in cutting down your likelihood of getting a stroke. Because remember, 80% of strokes are preventable. So if that being the case, don't you want to try and avoid your stroke? And then success in maximizing your recovery, and those are our missions. And strokerecoveryfoundation.org is the website to look for. And as I say, that was another new lifestyle move for myself. So looking for new therapies, looking for new lifestyle, and the caregiver, I say, laugh to the extent you can. Find a way to, try to find a way to have a good life, because there is a way to have a good life. You know, Debbie and I travel. I look forward to coming to Japan in the future and meeting some of the folks who are Japanese and connecting with other people who have come from other countries. And that is one of the things we're doing. So if there are questions, my contact information is here. I'm sorry I'm not there to answer the questions, but I'm glad to answer questions by email. And so thank you very much. It's been an honor to speak here, and God bless. Enjoy the convention, and I look forward to seeing you at a later date. Good day.